One innovation that did more than any other to change the cultural makeup of Europe. And it's this paper. The idea almost certainly came from the Chinese via trade exchange, and it is revolutionary technology. Unlike parchment and vellum, it's cheap and it's easy to mass produce. And when the Arabs come to Spain, they start to open paper-making factories. Paper allows you to do three things very effectively. You can gather information, you can analyse and develop ideas in a very precise way, and then you can disseminate your newfound knowledge to a wider world. And in the 10th century, that was a potent mix.
Cordoba's love of books became legendary. Whilst the Royal Library of France contained 900 books in this period, just one of Cordoba's 70 libraries amassed over 500,000. These books contain some of the most sophisticated studies of astronomy in the world.
In Northern Europe at this time there is nothing, but there is nothing that can be considered the result of sophisticated astronomy.
Why do you think Muslim scholars were particularly interested in the heavens and the revolution of the stars?
I think they were interested in science in general terms. For example, calculating the sacred direction. If you have to say your prayers, you must face towards Mecca. Calculating the direction of Mecca from a given place is not so easy. It is a complicated mathematical problem for which the Arabs had exact solutions from the 9th century.
One of the ways in which the Muslims solved these problems was by developing a Greek instrument called the astrolabe. This is a calculator for telling the time of night or day. If it's lined up on a star above the horizon, the angle can be registered with a movable needle. The measurement is then transferred to the reverse side of the astrolabe, where a base plate represents the geographical location. And a star grid, like a map of the heavens, shows the position of the stars. By aligning the needle to the grid using the measurements, the time can be read off the face of the astrolabe, just like a clock. The astrolabe enabled nighttime navigation, which helped to advance sea travel, and this in turn set the stage for the coming era of worldwide exploration and discovery. Cordoban scientists were streets ahead of the rest of Europe, especially when it came to medicine.
This account comes from an Islamic physician who encountered a Christian doctor at work. They brought me a knight who had an abscess on his leg and a woman suffering from consumption. I made a plaster for the knight and the swelling opened and improved. For the woman, I prescribed a diet to revive her consumption. But then the Frankish doctor arrived and objected. "Bring me a strong knight with a well-sharpened battle axe," he said. The knight struck a blow, the marrow of the leg spurted out, and the wounded man died on the spot. As for the woman, their doctor affirmed the devil must have entered her head. Then he grasped a razor and cut an incision in the shape of a cross, exposing the bone of the skull and rubbing salt into the wound. The woman died in the instant. I returned home, having learnt much about the medicine of the Christians.
The hospitals of Cordoba were performing operations which wouldn't be seen in the rest of Europe for hundreds of years. The city's most famous surgeon was a man called Abu Qasis. He spent 40 years compiling a hugely influential medical compendium.
Chapter 30 dealt with surgery, and these are just some of the instruments that were illustrated in that chapter. This is a specialist device used by eye surgeons for the relief of hypertension. And these two over here were employed to perform successful tracheotomies. And in fact, the Abu Qasis method was still popular well into the 20th century.
As well as large scientific collections, more everyday documents have survived from Islamic Cordoba. These give a detailed insight to the society that was created here. What kinds of things are being recorded on these bits of paper?
In this document there was written everything, absolutely everything.
So does that mean that people in the lower classes of society could read?
Yes, there are poor people with a very good education. The education is a way to be a better Muslim. So being a better Muslim means that you know the Quran and you know everything of the law. The law is not a king law, it is the God law.
Divine law.
Divine law.
Have you got any physical examples of these documents?
Yes, I have one. Well, it is a contract about plowing the land. For 2 years we have to plant it with wheat and food, and he gets from this proportion of the production. The Muslim give a new thing. The land is mine. I rent you the land and you give me a part of the production. People are interested not in having hunting lands like a lord or squire in England. The landlord rent his land.
And it's empowering as well, because if you're the lowest rung of society and yet you have some rights to your own land and you can keep a lot of the produce.
Yes.
The origins of the Renaissance are generally believed to lie in Italy, where a renewed interest in the classics had a huge impact on art and culture. But the foundations of the Renaissance were laid much earlier, and not in Italy, but in a town called Toledo in Islamic Spain. Toledo was one of Al-Andalus's vulnerable city-states, and in 1085 the Christians seized control of it. Unusually, the handover went very smoothly, and as a result the Muslims already living in Toledo were allowed to remain as citizens and their mosques were left untouched. The city that emerged accommodated both Muslim and Christian.
Spain at this time is a paradox. On one hand, tensions between Muslims and Christians are becoming unbearable, and yet on the other, there is a hugely beneficial intellectual evolution that is only possible because Muslims and Christians are living side by side.
When Toledo fell to the Christians, its doors were opened to travellers and intellectuals from all over Europe. These people mixed with the Muslims in the city, learning their language and reading their books. Many of the adventurers came from England.
In the late 1100s, an Englishman known as Daniel of Morley travelled to Europe to study. But as his autobiography reveals, he was disgusted with what he found there. I stopped a while in Paris, and there I saw asses rather than men, pretending to be very important. They had desks in front of them, heaving under the weight of 2 or 3 immovable tomes, but because they did not know anything, they were no better than marble statues. I did not want to get infected by a similar petrifaction, but when I heard that the doctrine of the Arabs was in fashion in Toledo, I hurried there as quickly as I could so that I could hear the wisest philosophers in the world.
And here we have the preface in red. That's where we learn about the process of translation. In this case, we read that this book was translated by Gerard of Cremona. It is a medical treatise by Ibn Sina, by Avicenna, and it was translated ab Arabico, from Arabic, in Latinum, into Latin, in Toledo.
Yeah, it's a very rich document, isn't it? You get a sense of how valued these things were.
And there is all these little glosses on the right-hand side. People have been adding comments or explaining words that were not clear. Un momento, por favor. Vamos a...
Wow, that's a splendid beast of a thing. Is this looks like it's a work of Aristotle, is it?
Yeah, this is the Rhetorica by Aristotle. Rhetorica Aristotelis.
And here we are, look, here's a man who's working on it. Hermanus Alemanus.
Yeah, Hermann the German.
Hermann the German.
Yeah, even Germans came all the way to Toledo to find all these texts. And in this case, it is a commentary by Averroes on the text of Aristotle. Ah. And both are translated together.
So it's got added value because you've got new Arabic thought coming into the classical text.
Yeah, they are adding, they are supplementing, they are completing what was transmitted from the ancient world.
Knowledge really is power at this time in history.
It is. Having a book was something very, very valuable.
Do you find during this process that words slip from one language to another?
Absolutely. Chemia, that word came into Western languages as chemistry. But we have another word, alchemy, that comes originally from Greek through Arabic. They added the article in Arabic, al, and that gave alchemy.
English is full of words which came into the language from Arabic in this way. Many of them describe mathematical concepts which were completely new to Europe.
Algorithms are named after an Arabic mathematician, and the concept of zero comes from the Arabic sifr, which means empty. It's where we get our word cipher from. But of course, the most obvious and lasting impact is the use of Arabic numerals. And in this Spanish-Latin text, which dates from around about 986 AD, we have the first example of Arabic numerals written in Europe. Here they are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Imagine trying to do something like multiplication with Roman numerals. Once the numbers get above a certain amount, they are ridiculously unwieldy. This new, agile numerical system made everyday things like bookkeeping and accounting more accessible. Mathematics developed, and the construction of complex architectural projects became much easier. Recently, archaeologists renovating the roof timbers of Salisbury Cathedral in England made a discovery which clarifies this story.
On some of the beams that support the roof, there are a series of numbers that were carved in around 1200 AD when the cathedral was built. Now, that's a 3, and obviously it's familiar to us today, but in its time, it was a curious and progressive symbol.
At this time, everyone in England was still using the clunky old Roman numerals, but here in the rafters of one cathedral, a new trend appears to have caught on.
These numbers, the numbers that we use today, the fact that they're here is proof that the ordinary craftsmen who carved them benefited from an explosion of knowledge that started in Arabia and spread through Europe via Islamic Spain.
And the travellers from Toledo brought more than just practical knowledge back to England.
After a number of years, Daniel of Morley returned from Toledo, his cases crammed with documents and volumes. And when he arrived in England, he made an appointment to hand this precious booty over to his patron, who was a bishop. This benefactor was one of a team of scholars who wanted to establish their town as a centre of learning. And the name of the town was Oxford.
The universities that were founded in Paris, Bologna and Oxford at this time based their new curriculum on the radical ideas which were pouring out of Toledo.
One of Daniel of Morley's compatriots
developed a massive program of translations in which they translated from Greek into Arabic everything that had reached them. And this was something that was promote it, but the whole society. And the result of this is that they translated practically all Greek knowledge. There is a first period in which they translate and they learn, they assimilate. Later, they had learned enough, and they began to produce original works by themselves and to criticize Greek science. And of course, one cannot say that the Arabs were mere transmitters of Greek science. They were the people that continued the work of Greek scientists until they led all this research into a final crisis. And this final crisis was the crisis that brought the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. If they had not done this, Renaissance and scientific revolution would have been impossible.
It would take time for these groundbreaking ideas to become assimilated into Christian Europe. But once they were, Western intellect was transformed. The works of Aristotle were taught in the new universities. The medical treatises of Avicenna were used in hospitals. And Arabic translations of Greek geometry and those new Arabic numerals were passed on to craftsmen and architects. This was a critical stage in the growth of Western thought. We should no longer see the Renaissance as a rebirth, but the continuation of an intellectual movement which had been nourished centuries earlier by Muslims.
The Italian Renaissance is famous for reviving classical learning, but in fact what's happening here 400 years earlier seems to be just as vital. Do you think that Muslim scholars aren't given due credit for what they're doing in Islamic Spain at this time?
It is not something that you would learn about in school, probably, or even at university. It was probably conscious process of neglect, and now we are still suffering from that.
Extremely selective history writing.
That's right. It is due to the conflict that existed between the two worlds